parents kicked me out because of my sister's pregnancy. Now they're reaching out a year later to mend things, but I've moved on. My parents kicked me, 19F, out of my house almost a year ago. Just a few weeks after turning 18. That wasn't even the worst part. It happened during finals week in high school, and I had nowhere to go. Fortunately, I have good friends. Since my best friend and her parents took me in, and I'm quite grateful to them. My parents kicked me out because my older sister became pregnant, and they thought she needed to move back home so she could be well cared for. She is not even my whole biological sister. She is a half-sister. My mother had been dating my stepfather, Jacob, while they were in college, and she became pregnant a few months before graduation. However, she was too young at the time and chose not to marry him. It was only a fling, and they split up. Jacob, on the other hand, remained determined to be a father, so they co-parented Sasha, my half-sister, and maintained contact. When Sasha was 3, my mother met my biological father. They dated for 2 years before marrying. 1 year into their marriage, she became pregnant with me. However, my father was not prepared and wanted to end the pregnancy. My mother refused, and they separated ways after my father abandoned my pregnant mother. She severed all relations with him and his family before reconciling with Jacob. My father had passed away by the time I was born, and my mother and Jacob reared me. They married a few years after her divorce from my father was finalized, but I never regarded Jacob as a family member because he never treated me as such. I guess Jacob reunited with my mother while she was pregnant with me because he still loved her and wanted to be on her good side, but to him, I was always a burden. He'd been frigid to me since I was a child, and Sasha treated me similarly. While I got along well with my mother, I never developed a bond with Jacob or Sasha. Despite the fact that we lived as a family, they always treated me as an outsider. My mother has always claimed to love me as much as they do, but I've never felt that way. She never acknowledged our arrangement, and despite my attempts to connect with them when I was younger, I was always rejected. As I grew older, I saw what was going on and gave up on pursuing a relationship with Jacob and Sasha. I shouldn't have been surprised when they kicked me out because Sasha was expecting and wanted to move back in. However, it came as a shock. I should have known that Sasha would always be Jacob's priority, no matter how much older she was than me. Still, I hoped my mother would defend me, but she didn't. Sasha approached me around a year ago, just 2 days before finals week, and informed me that she was pregnant. She was 24 at the time, which made her 6 years older than me. Despite this, my parents decided to kick me out to create a place for her and help her save money. Sasha and her boyfriend, who had been together since high school, lived in a little apartment not far from our house. I thought it was appropriate for her to remain there, but she wanted to return home. She didn't feel safe remaining in the apartment alone because she works from home and her partner has to travel for work on occasion. She wanted to move back in with her parents while pregnant to avoid being alone and save money on rent. Her boyfriend was also planning to move in with her at our apartment. So Sasha and my parents decided she would return home. That would have been okay with me, but they informed me I had to vacate my room for a few months since they required it for her. Sasha already had a room in our house, but after she left for college, Jacob converted it into an office. My parents informed me she couldn't stay in the living room. Therefore, the only option was for me to give up my room. They asked that I think of it as a sacrifice for my family. I might not have been as upset if they hadn't had this chat with me immediately before my first exam. I was already stressed from preparing for tests, and I had a lot of exams coming up in the next 2 weeks. They only worried about Sasha and her pregnancy. I put my foot down and told them I wasn't leaving because Sasha had never treated me like family, so I didn't need to make any sacrifices for her. My parents attempted to reason with me, but I believe they were being unreasonable, and we argued until they snapped. Jacob told me I had to leave by the end of the week, or I'd be tossed out. And no one could stop him because I was an adult. He stated that he had the right to decide whether or not I may stay at his place. I expected my mother to protect me, but instead, she sided with Jacob. She stated they needed to make room for their real grandkids and didn't have the time or energy to argue with me about it. She told me to do as I was told. My mom's use of the word, real grandkids, reaffirmed what I had already felt and known for years. My mom, Sasha, and Jacob were their own little family, and I had always been an outsider. I was really unhappy and decided to begin packing my things right away, oblivious to the fact that I had an exam the following day. They didn't even try to stop me as I departed, revealing where their priorities lay. I ended up on my best friend's doorstep. When I explained everything to her and her parents, they invited me to stay with them as long as I wanted. Many of you may wonder why I didn't ask for support from family members, but I don't know any. Jacob's family is exactly like him. They don't like me at all. And I knew addressing them would be futile. They would do everything they could to avoid helping me. My mother's side of the family is also unfamiliar to me. Apparently, her parents and the rest of the family abandoned her when she became pregnant with Sasha. They wanted her to concentrate on her studies and did not want her to continue with the pregnancy because she was too young. She did it anyhow, and no one has spoken to her since. They weren't even present for her wedding to my father, nor for Sasha's or my birth, as she told me. So, since I had no relatives, I turned to my pals. After I was kicked out and moved in with my best friend and her family, I was continually expecting my mother to contact me. I had no such expectations of Jacob or Sasha because I knew they didn't care about me and were probably relieved I left because I never fit into their perfect family. What really hurt me was that my mother didn't contact me after a few months. I gave up hope completely. A full year has passed since then, and I've heard from a few people that Sasha gave birth a few months back. She and her boyfriend have been sharing how pleased they are to be parents to their baby. The three of them are still living with my parents, perhaps to save money on rent. I honestly couldn't care less about any of it. I've been working on improving my own life. After I graduated from high school, I needed to figure out how to get to college with little contact with my parents. I also lacked money. My best friend's parents had graciously allowed me to live rent-free, but I couldn't ask them to pay for my schooling, especially since they had 2 children of their own. I was anxious. But fortunately, I had applied for several scholarships. Because I'm a good student, I was able to obtain a scholarship from one of the institutions I applied to. It wasn't my first or even second choice, but I couldn't pass up the opportunity to save money. Sasha already had a room in our house, but after she left for college, Jacob converted it into an office. My parents informed me that she could not stay in the living room, so the only logical choice was for me to give up my room. They begged me to consider it a sacrifice for my family. If they hadn't told me this just before my first exam, I wouldn't have been so unhappy. I was already nervous about studying for my examinations, which were due in the following 2 weeks, but they seemed to be more concerned with Sasha and her pregnancy. I put my foot down and told them I wasn't leaving, since Sasha had never treated me like family, so I didn't feel obligated to make any sacrifices for her. My parents attempted to reason with me, but I believed they were being unreasonable, and we argued until they snapped. Jacob told me that I had to go by the end of the week, or I would be tossed out because I was legally an adult. And he had the right to decide whether I stayed in his house or not. I expected my mother to protect me, but she sided with Jacob. She explained that they needed to make room for their real grandkids and did not have the time or energy to argue with me about it. Hearing her referring to Sasha's children as real grandkids reinforced what I had assumed for years. My mother, Sasha, and Jacob had their own small family, and I had always been the outsider. I was so unhappy that I started packing my things right away, ignoring the fact that I had a test the next day. They didn't even try to stop me as I departed, revealing where their priorities lay. I landed up at my best friend's house, and after explaining everything to her and her parents, they invited me to stay with them as long as I needed. You might wonder why I didn't ask other family members for assistance, but I don't really have any. Jacob's family dislikes me, so I knew it would be fruitless to seek assistance. I never knew anyone on my mother's side of the family. My mother always told me that when she became pregnant with Sasha, her family cut her off because they wanted her to focus on her studies. They didn't want her to get pregnant since she was too young, but she did anyway, and no one has spoken to her since. They weren't even present for her wedding, my father, let alone either of our births, according to her. So, I didn't think I had any relatives to turn to, so I went to my pals instead. After I was kicked out and moved in with my best friend and her family, I kept expecting my mother to contact me. I had no such expectations of Jacob or Sasha. as they clearly didn't care about me and were probably relieved that I had left. What pained me the most was that my mother did not reach out at all. After a few months, I gave up hope completely. It has been a year since then. I found out from friends that Sasha had given birth a few months ago and that she and her boyfriend have been posting about their new life as delighted parents. They are still living with my parents, probably to economize on rent. I honestly don't care about any of that stuff anymore. I've been working on improving my own life. After graduating from high school, I needed to figure out how to get to college. It wasn't easy without having my parents' financial assistance. My best friend's parents were generous enough to let me live rent-free, but I couldn't ask them to pay for my tuition, especially since they had 2 children of their own. I was apprehensive. But thankfully, I had applied for numerous scholarships, and because I was a brilliant student, I was awarded one. It was not my first or even second choice of education. But I couldn't pass up the opportunity to save money. The scholarship covered 60% of my tuition, so I chose to get a student loan alongside my closest friends' parents as co-signers. I promised them that they wouldn't have to worry about repaying the debt because I would work while studying and pay it off myself. That is what I have been doing. It's been difficult. But knowing I'm succeeding on my own is wonderful. I hadn't heard from my family in a year, and I wasn't expecting them to seek out. Surprisingly, approximately a week ago, my mother emailed me and asked me to come home for the weekend. She claimed she missed me, as did Jacob and Sasha, and they wanted to reconcile with me. She stated they were aware they had treated me unfairly in the email. My mother was unusually charming, faking sincerity. Call it gut instinct, but I sensed something was wrong and did not answer. A few days later, she wrote another email, which I disregarded as well. Despite my need to find out what was going on, I realized there had to be another reason. It was improbable they would suddenly feel sorry a year after kicking me out. It looked overly convenient. I received my response 2 days ago when my maternal grandparents contacted me. I was surprised they were able to contact me, as I was certain my parents had not given them my information. They explained that they had to inquire around and eventually obtained my phone number from one of my high school acquaintances who trusted them enough to disclose it. It turned out to be my best buddy, and I'm glad she didn't tell me, since it was a welcome surprise. My grandparents called, and I couldn't believe it was them. I've never known them, seen them, or heard their voices. I was hesitant at first, but then they FaceTimed me and showed me old photo albums of my mother from her childhood and adolescent years. That's when I started to believe they were my grandparents. We all got rather emotional. I'm not sure why, but I just did. We began talking, and I shared details about my life. I tried to avoid talking about my parents, but it was pointless because they already knew everything. They claimed that one of the main reasons they had not contacted me before was because of my parents. They recently discovered the truth, which prompted them to contact us. I was perplexed. My mother had always told me that when she became pregnant with Sasha, my grandparents cut her off. That was everything I knew. However, there was more to the story. My grandparents emphasized that they were not opposed to my mother having Sasha. Rather, they opposed her connection with Jacob. My mother had lied about her parents to safeguard Jacob's reputation. My grandparents had been supportive of her pregnancy and informed her she had the freedom to choose. However, they did not approve of Jacob because he was a well-known addict. They had all grown up in the same area, attended the same high school, and even went to the same college, so my grandparents were well aware of Jacob's background. They promised my mother that they would financially assist her during and after the pregnancy, but only if she broke up with Jacob. They didn't want him to influence her. After much thinking, my mother ended their relationship because Jacob couldn't get his life in order. My grandparents took complete custody of Sasha when she was born, and Jacob had only supervised visitation privileges for the first few years. Jacob eventually finished his degree and became clean, but he relapsed every several months. So my grandparents never trusted him completely. They introduced my mother to my father, who is the son of a family friend. After a few years of seeing one another on and off, my mother married him because she had given up hope that Jacob would ever recover, but it appears she has never completely moved on from Jacob. A year into her marriage, she began an affair with him and became pregnant again. At that time, my mother had to tell my father about the affair, since she couldn't picture her life without Jacob. Now that she was pregnant, she needed to tell him the truth. Her infidelity was the reason she got a divorce from my father and later married Jacob. So everything Mom said about my father's opposition to having me was a lie. After I was born, many paternity tests were performed, and I was happily not Jacob's child. I was, in fact, my biological father's daughter. Which was a relief because I had no desire to be Jacob's biological daughter. My father even had partial custody of me for a period, although I scarcely remember it because it was so long ago. Unfortunately, my biological father died in a vehicle accident when I was 7 months old, allowing my mother to lie to me for the remainder of my life. My father's side of the family refused to have anything to do with me after his death, which was convenient for my mother. My grandparents were really disturbed when they discovered my mother was having an affair with Jacob. They gave her another ultimatum. She could either shut Jacob out of her life completely and focus on her marriage with my father, or she could get a divorce and never speak to them again. This time, my mother chose Jacob because he had been clean for about a year longer than any of his previous stints. That was the final major disagreement my mother had with her parents. My mother was still pregnant at the time, and they did not communicate again until after my birth. My grandparents ultimately softened and decided to contact her so they could meet me. But Jacob refused to play along and form a happy family with them because of how they had treated him. So, my mother turned down their attempts to reunite. My grandparents did not give up. However, they attempted to contact my mother every several months, but she never accepted them back into her life. This continued on for years until Jacob and my mother had financial difficulties and were unable to pay their rent. My mother had no one else to turn to, so she contacted Ed, her parents. In a great gesture, my grandparents gave her a house, hoping that it would bring them closer together. It was about 6 years ago when my family moved into our new home. It was a great improvement over the apartment we used to live in. I'd often wondered how my parents could afford such a wonderful property in such a desirable neighborhood. Given that my mother was a receptionist and Jacob worked in sales. His company had been failing, so it seemed unlikely that they could afford it. I now realized that was all thanks to my grandparents. Despite this, my parents, being the ungrateful people they are, did not attempt to repair their relationship with my grandparents. Both my mother and Jacob were aware that my grandparents had paid for the house, but my mother insisted that they were not ready to reconnect and needed time to think about it. My grandparents, being naive, gave them room for a few months, but when my mother did not respond, they tried again. She kept claiming that she needed more time. This went on for years, and my grandparents eventually admitted that perhaps it wasn't meant to be. They were getting older and told me how humiliating it was to continually attempt to contact their daughter only to be denied each time. They finally admitted to my mother that they understood why she no longer wanted to be around them, and regretted themselves for not being gentler in the past. The only thing they wanted was that my mother continued to send photos of our family so that they knew we were doing fine. Surprisingly, my mother agreed, and for the past few years, that was how my grandparents stayed in touch, which was quite sad. They told me everything, and I burst into tears. I had always thought of them as villains, but that was not the case. No. As for how they discovered the truth, my grandfather just had a health scare with heart problems. And he and my grandma realized they couldn't keep pretending everything was fine because they weren't getting any younger. They wanted to make one final attempt to reconcile with the family before passing away. They stopped by my mother's house a few weeks ago, which is technically still theirs because they paid for it. And their names are on the deed. When they came, my mother had no choice but to welcome and entertain them. They discovered they were great-grandparents when Sasha had her children. But when they asked about me, my parents became really uneasy and had no idea what to say. So, they informed my grandparents that I was away at college and that it might not be a good time to contact me because I was in a vulnerable state due to examinations. They couldn't even come up with a false college name, which led my grandparents to suspect something was up. They had a gut feeling that my parents had made a mistake. So they left the house to speak with our neighbors. That is how they discovered that I had not been living with my parents for the past year after being kicked out. The neighbors didn't know why. But their son, who went to school with me, informed my grandparents that I had been staying with my closest friend's family for a while, and they could know more. That's how my grandparents got in touch with my best buddy, and they eventually found out what happened to me. Naturally, they were furious when they discovered the truth. My grandparents informed my mother that she and her family would need to evacuate the house in order to make room for their only real grandchild. It was the epitome of retaliation, using the identical things my parents had used on me. My best friend ensured that my grandparents knew just how to press that nerve. It now became clear why my parents were attempting to reach out and make amends. They were going to lose their home. My grandparents waited a few days to approach me after learning everything because they were concerned about how I would respond. They eventually decided to go forward with it since they had wasted so many years worrying about how my mother would respond, and they wanted to do the right thing now. However, my grandparents also wanted to give me the freedom to choose what I wanted. They told me that if I wanted to give my family another chance, they could continue to live in the house. But if I wanted them to leave, that is what would happen. Apparently, when they came, no one in the family seemed pleased to see them. And I was the only one who appeared truly interested in developing a relationship with them. My grandparents refused to be taken for fools anymore. So I had to decide whether I wanted my parents to have a home or not. If I'm being honest, I suppose I want them tossed out, but that sounds a little harsh. I'm not sure whether that's the appropriate thing to do. What if I told my grandparents I wanted to kick my family out? Update 1. Hello? First and foremost, thank you for all of your encouraging words. It means everything to me, and I appreciate it more than I can express. Regarding my decision, I've concluded that I do want my family to leave that house. I told my grandparents a few days ago, and now they're evicting my family. Of course, there's a lot of legal stuff involved, which my grandparents say I don't need to worry about. My parents have also been emotionally manipulative, particularly Sasha, but my grandparents are impervious to it. After speaking with me, they learned about all the falsehoods my mother had been spreading and how she had poisoned their grandchildren against them. They have no more sympathy for my parents. To be honest, Sasha and her partner are working grown-ups, so I'm confident they'll find something out just like millions of others. The same applies for my parents. I don't feel guilty about any of it. After all, they didn't feel horrible about kicking me out, knowing I was just 18 and still in school. Despite this, I was able to perform well academically, even though it occurred just before my exams. I urged my grandparents not to worry about my college tuition, but they insisted on handling the student loan I had taken out. They also apologized for not being present for me sooner. We have a lot to talk about and make up for, but everything is going great right now. Update 2. Hello? My grandparents began evicting my family a few weeks back, and they have till the end of next month to depart. My mother is not pleased about it. She felt compelled to inform me, writing an email a few weeks ago in an attempt to regain my trust and heal things, most likely so her parents wouldn't kick her out. The email was quite different from the one I had received before. This one was full of swear words, saying she wished she hadn't given birth to me. She even said she wishes I had been in the vehicle accident with my father so we might both have died. So, that's my mom for you. But it no longer bothers me, since to me she is not family. If I'm being honest, my only family now consists of my grandparents, my best friend, her parents, and a few relatives whom my grandparents are introducing me to. My mother broke them off long ago since she didn't want anything to do with her family. It's an unusual scenario, but I'm adjusting. Update 3. Hello? The holidays have just begun, and I'm back home in my old house. It feels strange to be here, but my grandparents have been living in the house since my family departed, and they've done an excellent job of renovating it. Even my room seems like home again. We'll be throwing a Thanksgiving dinner shortly, and we've invited some family members, my best friend, and her parents. I feel like my life is finally getting back on track. I'm very happy, and I wish I could stay this way forever. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you. My mom married a younger guy and wanted him to walk me down the aisle instead of my dad. When I said no, she skipped my wedding. Hello, everyone. So I had a terrible disagreement with my mom a few days ago, on the day of my wedding, or rather after everything was done. It was entirely her fault. But I recently spoke with my grandmother, and unwittingly made matters worse for her. That is why I have begun to question whether what I did was justified or not. I'm 24F and have been with my partner, 24M, for the past 10 years. We began dating in high school, and he is the love of my life, so this wedding was a big event for me. We got engaged last year and spent months trying to make it an experience that everyone would remember. He and I had saved a lot of money to pay for it, but my mother was unconcerned. My parents split when I was 6 years old, and they have been co-parenting me ever since. They never got along, and I honestly don't know how they managed to stay married for so long. They were married for about 3 years before I was born and were together for another 6 years before splitting up. Most children are upset when their parents tell them they are getting divorced. But when they explained it to me, I was ecstatic. For me, it meant they wouldn't have to fight every day, and if they were happy, I might finally have a chance to be happy as well. As a child, I was satisfied with their decision, and they shared custody of me. I'd spend half the month at my father's house and the other half at my mother's. Unfortunately, I rejoiced too soon. I didn't understand that even in a co-parenting arrangement, they'd have to communicate with each other and reach an agreement on issues concerning me. They struggled even with that. They were continually bad-mouthing each other in front of me, making me feel caught in the crossfire. Both believed the other was out to make things tough for them. And I tried to be understanding as a child, but by middle school, I'd had enough. While staying with my father, he got into a disagreement with my mother because she wanted to rearrange the schedule to accommodate an event, which he did not agree with. I began to feel like a burden for both of them. That night, I packed a few belongings and went away. I was just 12. I walked to the bus stop, but because there was a scary person there, I retreated to a park near my house and decided to go to the bus station in the morning. Fortunately, I fell asleep in the park, and nothing happened to me. By daybreak, my father had recognized I was missing and called the cops. I was taken home safely. When my parents realized I had run away, they confronted me about my situation. I told them they made me feel like a burden since they were constantly arguing over me. That's when they agreed to be better to one another for my sake. They had no idea I'd take such drastic measures in response to their behavior. After that, my father stuck to his word. Even when he battled with my mother, he didn't tell me about it. So I didn't feel bad. My mother, on the other hand, would periodically forget and yell at me about my father. It made things difficult because I genuinely loved both of my parents. Neither were villains. They simply couldn't get along, making parenting difficult for them. It's difficult to raise a child when you dislike each other, but my father made an effort. My mother, on the other hand, did not take her vow very seriously. Eventually, I became closer to my father instead. I would spend time with her when I visited her on her turn to have me, and we would have a good time together. So, I didn't love her any less, but I felt closer to my father. After I grew up and departed for college, my father maintained in touch with me more than my mother. So right now, I would certainly declare that I favor my father over my mother. However, I have always treated them with equal love and respect. What happened recently was simply too entitled for me to handle, so I ended up hitting out at her. My parents dated other individuals following their divorce, and my father decided to marry again around 4 years ago. He had been dating my stepmother for over 3 years by that point, and their relationship was serious, so it made sense for him to marry again. Prior to that, he had only had a couple of relationships that went nowhere. My mother, however, took a slightly different approach. She would only have flings after the divorce and would not commit to anyone, even if the other guy was interested. I'm not judging her, that's her decision, and I respect it, but then she contacted me unexpectedly around 6 months ago and informed me she had been seeing a guy for a few months, and the two of them had decided to marry. She wanted me to be present for the wedding. I had no idea what was going on because everything happened so quickly and unexpectedly. But she told me she was confident in this person, and he appeared to be confident in her as well. She had a good time for many years, but now she wished someone would be there for her. Her husband, James, false name, had just been with my mother for 4 months when they married, and they appeared to be in love, but I was apprehensive about their bond. For starters, he was about a decade younger than her. Furthermore, they had only known one another for a short period of time. James had proposed they marry, and my mother had mentioned it often at the ceremony. But I don't think she realized that wasn't the circumstance she expected because it only made things appear more suspicious. I tried to talk to her about it, but she dismissed me and said she was certain of her decision, so I didn't explore it further since I didn't want to come off as judgmental. For what it's worth, he seemed to be into her. So I went to the wedding along with a handful of her close friends and relatives. I even wished them the best. When I informed my father about all of this, he was startled that she had married someone she had only known for a few months, but by then it had already been completed. After that, I was too preoccupied with preparing my own wedding to worry about what was going on with my mother and James, who appeared content enough. They'd been married for 6 months, and I haven't seen her much because she spends all of her time traveling with him. She didn't even come to my bridal shower, but I had no complaints. However, the night before my wedding, while we were all at the hotel, she knocked on my door and informed me that she had something extremely important to talk about with me, so I allowed her inside. That's when she decided to inform me that she overheard me talking to my father about leading me down the aisle, and she assumed I'd asked James to do it at the rehearsal supper. She expected me to ask James, but I didn't even though I had previously asked her. I decided to have both of my parents follow me down the aisle since I felt it would be more appropriate for my family dynamics. I did not want my mother to feel left out. I had no idea why she was even discussing James. I was shocked that she would think such a thing. I'd only known James for a few months, and as long as my father was alive, I wasn't going to let any random person accompany me down the aisle on my wedding day. To me, James was simply my mother's husband, not my stepfather. I made it quite plain to her. I informed her that I had no plan of asking James at any time, and if she thought I would, she was misinformed. I'd never mentioned or hinted at anything like that. So I had no idea why she suddenly believed it. It was just ridiculous. To make matters worse, when she realized I was serious and that my biological father would be walking me down the aisle instead of her husband, she threw a fit in my room. She stated that if this were the case, she and James would not attend the wedding. Apparently, she had assumed that I was closer to her, and so James would be the one to walk me down the aisle. She felt that if both she and my father accompanied me down the aisle, it would convey the incorrect message and make James feel insecure. She kept having her tantrums, but I didn't have time for them, especially the night before my wedding when I needed to sleep. So I ended it by informing her that if she didn't want to attend the wedding, she could leave with James. Then I requested her to leave my room so that I could sleep. When I awoke the next morning, my mother was not there. I told everyone close to me about what happened the night before, including my immediate family, spouse, and bridesmaids. I knew I'd be busy for the rest of the day, so there was no time to ponder about her. Looking back, I'm grateful for it because it would have probably ruined my mood. My father and stepmother eventually walked me down the aisle, and a few people exchanged puzzled looks, but no one said anything because it was clear I wanted it to be a happy day without any issues. I like my stepmother, so I didn't mind when she walked me down the aisle, and the wedding went well. But 1 hour before the celebrations were to conclude, my mother arrived at the reception with James, and she had a really embarrassed expression on her face, so I knew she was there to apologize. I had been drinking, and I was overjoyed from just getting married, so I didn't mind her returning for the reception and was more than willing to forgive her. I accepted her apology and told her she may join everyone else. Instead, she stayed by our side and explained that she had a favor to ask. She asked us to rework the wedding ceremony so she could be a part of it as well. My husband and I were both stunned by the absurdity of the request, and we instantly denied, but then she began pleading with us, and even James was concerned. He said that she needed us to do this as a favor because otherwise my grandmother would cut her off. Both of my father's parents attended the wedding, but my grandmother, my mother's only surviving parent, was unable to attend due to her out-of-state residence and medical concerns that precluded her from traveling. I promised my grandmother I'd send her a video of the wedding. While my mother and James were driving home, my grandmother video called my mother to chat with me. That's when my mother realized she had made a mistake, and she was now worried about what her mother would think about her actions during my wedding. That's why she asked me to recreate the ceremony so she could be a part of it, and my grandmother wouldn't find out what occurred. My mother honestly thought it was a reasonable answer because the venue was still paid for, the decorations were up, and the majority of the guests hadn't left yet. But I held firm and informed my mother that she chose to leave the previous night, and it was her fault. I was not going to restart my wedding only to correct her mistake. She began arguing, insisting that we do things her way so that her mother would not cut her off. My grandmother loves family relationships, and the only reason she couldn't go was health. If she found out my mother had done anything so dumb, she would not hesitate to cut her off because I am her only grandchild, and she cherishes me. Everyone knew she would be devastated if she found out what my mother had done. That's why my mother was so determined to resolve the matter before my grandmother found out. I wasn't in the mood for a battle with my mother, and my grandmother kept attempting to video call her, so I, phone in hand, took my phone from her. And before my mother could say or do anything, I FaceTimed my grandmother to tell her the truth. I had had enough of my mother's moaning. My grandmother was delighted to see me, and after a brief discussion about the wedding, I got right to the issue. I told her exactly what had happened to my mother, and how she wanted me to restart the wedding, especially for her. I did all of this in front of my mother, who was frozen in place when I turned the phone around so my grandmother could face her. My mother said nothing. My grandmother raged at her for a full 6 minutes, expressing her disappointment. She informed my mother that she did not need to return home for the holidays, and did not want to speak with her until I had forgiven her. Only then would she contemplate making amends with my mother again. After my grandmother hung up, my mother and James remained there, speechless. I expected them to have an outburst, but they didn't. They simply went after a few minutes without saying anything, which was ideal because throwing a tantrum would have wrecked the rest of the reception. We decided not to talk about my mother or James for the remainder of the evening so that they would not ruin it for us. My grandmother called the day after the wedding, after we had returned home, to discuss all that had happened. She revealed that she had been having problems with my mother for some months as a result of her decision to marry James. My grandmother had been extremely opposed to my mother's fast marriage from the start because they had only known each other for a few months. She didn't think it was wise for my mother to rush into a marriage like that, which made sense, but my mother paid no heed to her. They didn't talk for a few months after the wedding because my grandmother called it a bad decision, and my mother took offense. After a few months, my mother apologized and went to visit my grandmother with James to make things right. Despite my grandmother's kindness, James remained apart from her. He pretended he was too good to converse with her, rejecting all of her attempts to get to know him. This gave my grandmother a negative impression of him, and she began to dislike him even more. After that visit, she told my mother about her fears, and they argued. Throughout the last few months, my mother kept playing the same card, claiming that her parents thought my father was the appropriate guy for her, but marrying him proved to be the worst mistake of her life. She felt my grandmother was unwilling to give James a fair chance because they hadn't been together long. My grandmother believed she had given him a fair chance, emphasizing that her problems were with the hasty nature of the marriage, not James as a person. However, James took it personally and continued his attitude, resulting in increased tension. Things had been strained between my mother and grandmother for months, and the recent FaceTime call on the day of my wedding was the final straw for my grandmother. She couldn't believe my mother skipped my wedding simply because I refused to let James lead me down the aisle. We had no idea whether James or my mother had come up with this concept, but it made no difference. My mother chose to miss my wedding, then pretended it never happened and wanted me to recreate everything so my grandmother would not find out. After discussing it, my grandmother and I understood that my mother had taken both of us for granted. We resolved not to speak with her for a few months until we were ready to forgive her, or she really apologized. My grandmother wrote a message to my mother on our behalf, asking her not to contact us until we were ready to communicate, and hoping she would respect that. I thought this was a decent answer. But my mother began blaming me for everything. She wrote me nasty messages last night claiming that it was my fault that her own mother was not speaking to her. She remarked that if I didn't want to redo the wedding, I could have simply said so, which I did several times. She accused me of intentionally escalating the situation by involving my grandmother. She felt that I didn't need to tell my grandmother, and give her more reasons to be furious with her. My mother thought I was ganging up on her by recruiting my grandmother. and she thought it was unjust. She did not think I should have dragged my grandmother into our argument. I think she's simply whining, but she could have a point. Is it my fault for bringing my grandmother into this conflict with my mother? Update 1. Thank you to everyone who provided positive comments on my post. I've decided to block my mother and end this nonsense. I don't need to put up with her conduct anymore. She's been acting strangely since she started dating James. And I don't need such negativity in my life. My husband and I are heading to Paris for our honeymoon next week, and I want to enjoy ourselves without worrying about my mother. Blocking her means that I don't hear from her throughout this period. I've always tried to treat Mom with the same love and respect that I've shown my father, but after all of this, I no longer feel bound to do so. My father has always treated me better, so I don't think it's wrong to stop treating her equally. I discussed everything with my grandmother, father, and husband, and they all believe that barring her is the proper decision. Most of them say I should have blocked her a long time ago, perhaps on the day of the wedding itself. But I delayed because it was difficult for me to let go of the concept of having a nice relationship with my mother. It now has to be completed. I can't let her treat me this way and get away with it. And I'm going to make sure I put my foot down now. Update 2. Hello everyone. Well, my hubby and I are departing for our honeymoon tomorrow. I must have told it to my mother at some point, as she appeared to remember. I'm not sure how I feel about what just transpired, but I'm going to post it here because I feel compelled to keep you all informed. In my previous update, I noted that I had blocked my mother everywhere, so she sent an email to my work email address, which I had not blocked. I didn't expect her to contact me there, so I was thrown off guard. I had intended to delete the email, but curiosity got the better of me, and I ended up reading it with my spouse. We both felt strange at the conclusion because my mother expressed her love for me and apologized for her recent actions. In the email, she explained that the only reason she wanted James to lead me down the aisle was because he insisted. She claimed it was not her idea and even attempted to postpone the wedding for a few months to get to know him better. James put pressure on her, and the night before the wedding, he twisted her into believing that if my father walked me down the aisle instead of him, people would misinterpret it. She supported him throughout the email because she loved him. But she also expressed regret over everything. She felt torn between James and her family, and she could now relate to how I felt as a child of divorce. She acknowledged James's tendency to be controlling, but she didn't mind it. After chatting for a few days, they both agreed that his domineering nature had produced problems in the family. He committed to work on it, and she pledged to stand up for herself rather than be a doormat. She closed the email by wishing us well and expressing her want to reconnect once we return from our honeymoon. What worries me isn't the apology, it's that James might not be the appropriate guy for my mother, although she stated that they will work on it. The way she characterized James gave me the impression that something was wrong and that she was covering for him. My husband and I are going tomorrow, so we cannot deal with this right now. We decided to let her handle the situation. I notified my father, who, regardless of his feelings for my mother, would never harm her since he is a wonderful person. I also told one of her closest friends, whom she has known since childhood, and I'm convinced she would not gossip with her friend. My father is informed. I feel certain that my mother will be cared for, and that I will be able to enjoy a worry-free honeymoon. Update 3. Hello, this is going to be a brief update. I last posted an update around 4 months ago, just before leaving for my honeymoon. We intended to deal with whatever was going on with my mother and James when we returned. But when I emailed my mother following our return, I never received a response. Her friends informed me she appeared to be happy, so I figured everything was okay and moved on with my work. Fast forward to 2 weeks ago, and I heard from my mom again. She thanked me for telling her friend about my concerns about James, especially because she lacked the guts to express them herself. It turns out I was correct. James was not the ideal guy for her. He had tried to isolate her from everyone, even urging her to cut links with a childhood acquaintance. After she repeatedly canceled plans with her friend challenged her, and my mother eventually broke down and told everything. James had been treating her horribly, and she couldn't take it any longer. She filed for divorce with the help of a friend and has been living with them ever since. My mother thanked me for looking out for her and informing her friend about my concerns. Without that, she doubted anyone would have noticed what was going on. I'm pleased she's getting out of the situation, and I hope we can all assist her moving forward. Even my grandmother was surprised, but we're all doing our best to support my mother. We simply hope that things improve from here. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.